For my next thought of the day reflections, I've been having a few ideas that I've been writing down on a list, and the one I kind of wanted to pick up today is that just through different things, I've just really felt drawn in this season, this last year, maybe more, but recently in the last months especially, just drawn to the book of James. And so I thought for some thought of the day reflection fodder for my YouTube channel, I would just be leading some reflections on the book of James. I don't know if I'd call them sermons or whatever. I don't think they'll be like in-depth teachings like you might find on my podcast. If you're curious about the literary structure of James, which is fantastic, you can listen to the episode. I'll link that in the description below this video. I'm not sure I'll be doing the same kind of thing I would do on my podcast here in these teachings. We'll just see more of like a thought of the day, a devotional reflection. I've just been drawn to the book of James and thought it would be fun to have some conversation about that during these times. Maybe if we can get this done before the high holidays, if maybe we can get through the whole book of James before Rosh Hashanah shows up. Rosh Hashanah. If that happens, and I start making a few more festival edition videos, maybe that's my goal. We'll see if we can pull that off. But today's reflection, we're going to get into this at the beginning of the book of James. We'll see how far we get. I don't think we'll get far. I don't think our conversation today is going to be real long, and I don't think it will be horribly profound. But I think it will set the stage for some of the good stuff that I'm looking forward to talking about maybe later. So I'm going to head over to the book of James and just start reading and reflecting and add some commentary here. But this is James. So let's see here. First verse, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. So this is the James who is the a leader of the church in Jerusalem, what some would call the Jewish church. Like in that early church, there was really, I don't want to say two parties or two perspectives, but there were two realities in that early church. There was a church in Jerusalem, kind of centered in Jerusalem. It was mostly largely Jewish. And then there was kind of the rest of the church in Asia and Asia Minor, which was becoming more and more Gentile as the decades went on. Some would call that the Church of Paul. So the church in Jerusalem would be the Church of James, and the church kind of everywhere else, a lot of people have called the Church of Paul. A lot of scholarship has said these were almost two separate churches and very distinct. I don't agree with that. In order to do that, you kind of have to ignore the record of the book of Acts and think that it's not accurate. So I think there were two different personalities. And again, we talk about that in that episode in the podcast. I'll link that podcast episode below. And I've also done a video about who I believe James was, because I don't have a popular opinion when it comes to who James is. A lot of people think that this James is James, the brother of Jesus, that he was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. I don't think that makes any historical sense at all. And so I believe that when Jesus had Peter, James, and John, I believe that was Peter and John, son of Zebedee, but I think it's James, son of Alphaeus, who would be a cousin of Jesus, ergo a brother. In the Hebraic mind, brother can be cousin, brother. It could be any horizontal relationship, a nephew. Any of those could be brothers. Fathers would be any horizontal relationship, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, ancestor, that'd be a father. And brother is a horizontal. So vertical relationship, father, brother refers to a horizontal relationship. That's who I think this James is. It's not a popular opinion. There's a couple verses in Matthew that I have to be able to explain because it identifies James as a son of Zebedee. But I'll link that video and that explanation in the description below as well. That's who I believe James is. James, the leader of the church in Jerusalem, that's going to be less debated. As far as which James it is, that will be more debated, and my opinion would not be the popular academic one. But there you go. Nonetheless, I told you this wasn't going to be academic, and here I go. I can't help myself. To the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. So likely a very Jewish audience, which you would expect from James, the leader of a very Jewish church centered in Jerusalem. So the 12 tribes, it could be the 12 tribes could be more poetic. It could be a reference to all of God's people, Jew and Gentile. Likely what's being said here is that James is writing to a very Jewish audience. That's how I see it. That's how I read it. And mainly he's writing this letter, not that it won't be read in Jerusalem, but that it's going to be circulated to all the Jews throughout the diaspora. The diaspora is the scattering of the Jewish people. There's been a few different diasporas throughout history, and where the Jews kind of ended up all over the civilized world of their day. So James is writing this letter to a Jewish audience kind of scattered abroad. He says this, he says, "Consider it pure joy." I'm reading out of the NIV for anybody wondering which translation I'm using. "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds." Consider it pure joy whenever you face. Think about this last year and a half, 2 years. There has been lots of different trials. There's been lots of beautiful things we've discovered too, but there's been plenty of trials. People have had to deal with death of loved ones or friends. People have lost jobs, dealt with mental illness, trials we haven't even begun to unpack yet. Consider it pure joy. That's a hard verse to hear. It's different when you're just kind of hearing it in church. Oh, you put that within a context. And James, his audience, the 12 tribes scattered abroad, they have a context. They understand their own, they have their own story, their own trials, their own tribulations, their own suffering. It's different when you're sitting in the middle, when you set this in context. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. There's all kinds of suffering. There's all kinds of trial. Some of it really grievous and difficult. And some of it like more annoying. But there's many kinds of trials. Consider those things. Consider it pure joy, he says. It's difficult, Brother James, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. So as we think about this last year and a half and the different trials we've been through, James, the Apostle James says, consider it joy because you know that going through this produces perseverance. It produces something real and rooted, and there's a depth to it. There's a realness, and there's a perseverance. Okay, well that's a little bit different. Don't just consider it pure joy to be suffering. Not that. No. The suffering is still suffering. The suffering is still yuck. The suffering is still suffering. The suffering still sucks. However, consider those opportunities joyful because they produce something in us, because they are opportunities. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete. Maybe there's actually more profound depth here than I was prepared for, and I got started here today. Let perseverance finish its work. Like wherever we sit today in the middle of all of this, like COVID, post-COVID. Can we say post-COVID yet? Are we at all starting to see the next chapter? I don't know. I don't know if we are. I don't know. I'm not saying yes. I'm not saying no. But wherever we're at, let perseverance finish its work. Don't race on too quickly. Whatever we're doing, don't just I'm struggling with that right now. Like now I can get on, I've been vaccinated, lots of other people that I know, that my family members that needed to be in a much safer position, they've been taken care of. And so now I'm like, well, I got to get on a plane. I got to go. I got to start going again. I got to start producing again. I got to start. Let perseverance finish its work. Be careful, Marty. Be careful, listener. Be careful that you don't just race on. And these trials had an opportunity to produce in us perseverance, but if we don't let it finish its work, The danger is that we may miss the opportunity entirely. Don't do that. Don't miss that opportunity. Be rooted, be aware, slow down. I know that we feel like we've been doing nothing but slowing down for a year and a half. Don't just turn up the speed. Stay, whoa, whoa, whoa. That's one of my personal mantras right now. Whoa, whoa. Like I'm pulling up on a rein of horses. Like there's this thing in me that I just want to like ride off into that whoa, whoa, whoa. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you will be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. You don't want to miss out on the opportunity to get the good stuff. And that doesn't make this any less difficult, but don't miss the good stuff. If any of you lacks wisdom, after hearing all that, does anybody feel like they lack wisdom? Oh, like if you're listening to this and you're like, oh man, I don't want any of that. Is that really is that really wisdom? If any of you lacks wisdom, there are days I definitely feel like I do. You should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault. So God's not ready to find fault with you for, God gives generously. He doesn't find fault. Like if you've been blowing it, if you've been racing ahead, if you don't get it, if you lack wisdom, God's not like, oh, come on, Marty. Why weren't you ready for it? God doesn't find fault. He gives generously. He's just glad that you know now. Maybe you didn't know for weeks, months, years, but you know now, and God's just glad that you know now and are responding. And it will be given to you, but when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. Man, it feels like a harsh verse, doesn't it? Feels like but if you lack wisdom, this is kind of hard. You're in the middle of suffering. You're in the middle of trial. But whatever you do, you can't doubt. I mean, you know me. If you know my ministry, you know my whole ministry is built on the premise that it's okay to ask questions, that it's okay to doubt. That doubt is a very real. And I don't think this undoes any of that. I think that what James is truly getting at here, because it feels like this harsh verse, and yet what James is saying is you can't, like he says, being double-minded. You can't be double-minded. Like you need to be all in on this. Like if you're going to make it through trial and suffering and consider it pure joy, if you're going to pursue perseverance and let it like maturity, if you're going to ask God for wisdom, if that's the path you really, like Jesus talked about the narrow way, like be careful to walk on the narrow path, because the way to destruction is wide and lots of people find it, but the way to life is narrow and only a few people can. It takes intention. You're not going to stumble. You're not going to stumble into the kingdom by accident. You're not going to stumble onto this path, which means you can't be double-minded, which means you can't be like, well, I'm going to hedge my bets. I want wisdom. I want perseverance, but I kind of also want to move on. I want perseverance to finish its work, but I don't really want to put the work in. Like you're going to have to believe. You're going to have to believe in this process. You're going to have to invest in it. You're going to have to trust the story. You're going to have to lean in all the way. Like lean in enough that all your weight is resting on it. You're not going to be able to hedge your bets and kind of be like, well, I want to consider it pure joy. I want maturity. I want wisdom. I want perseverance to finish its work, but I don't know. James says this process doesn't work like that, because it's going to take perseverance. This is going to be something that is going to require not a half-hearted attempt, because there will never be enough if it's half-hearted. Believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, but the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wild flower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plant. Its blossom falls and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away even while they go about their business. So James says, remember that this kingdom economy is all upside down. So in the middle of all this suffering, in the middle of all of this perseverance doing its work and making us mature and searching for wisdom and deciding that we're all in, James says, and let those that are in let those that have more poverty, literal and metaphorical poverty, let them take pride in the fact that they are somehow more connected to this thing that we're doing. There's somehow, and let those that are rich glory in their humiliation. Let us be reminded that the things that the world measures and the metrics of the world are really nothing, because they will fade away. Here today, gone tomorrow. I think Paul would say things like, he would remind us that our weakness is actually our strength. He would remind us that everything is upside down in the kingdom. The things that we think make us strong are actually can so many times be obstacles and hurdles that we have to overcome. And yet the things that we feel like make us so weak are actually, in the kingdom, pure opportunities to encounter God, to be used by God. Remember that everything is upside down. Remember when you're going through suffering. Remember when you're deciding, okay, I'm all in on this. I do want wisdom. I do want perseverance to finish its work. Remember that this does not operate by the world's rules, by the world's measuring sticks and metrics. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial. So if you're like, I don't know if James is still talking about perseverance, he is. So what he just said about kingdom economics is somehow deeply rooted in perseverance. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive a crown of life that the Lord has promised to him who love him. This is why you got to be all in. There's no crown of life for those people that are like, well, I'll kind of push in, but then I'll play it safe, and I'll push in, and I'll kind of play it safe. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. So this thing that goes on inside of us, this thing that leads to temptation, temptation doesn't come from God. Temptation is this thing that we talk about all the way at the beginning of the podcast. When we talk about, I'll put this in the description as well, the God who knows when to say enough, episode 2, and we talk about Adam and Eve and desire. God made us as full, complete human beings, and part of us as creatures, part of us is that we're just a creature, we're just a beast, and yet we are so much more because we're human beings. That's actually what the entire story of Adam and Eve is about, is the fact that we aren't beasts. We're human beings. And what does that mean? But there is this element to us that Paul will talk about in Romans 7, that there's this battle. We have this beast nature, this animal appetite. It's like this primal thing that's inside of us. But then there's the part of us that's more like God and that rises kind of above. It's this thing that's more true about us. But this animal appetite, this beast nature in us, that's what always wants to but yet we are also more. This is very real, and yet we're also more than that. And so when we're tempted, what's happening is that these two things are going to war within us. Something very real that's not evil. This part of us is not evil. The part of you that when you're hungry, that you want to eat, that's not a bad thing. That keeps you alive. This thing that is scared when you're in danger, that very primal animal urge in you, these are good things. These are things that are part of what it just means to be a living being. And yet, we're also more than that. We know at least we're supposed to know, we are designed for self-control. If you want to dive deeper into this, go listen to that episode 2 I'll put in the show notes. I'll put in the description of this video. We're designed for this temptation thing. It's not God tempting us. God is not setting up some temptation for us. Not when it comes to true temptation. There's testing. That can come from God. But then there's temptation that comes from within. There's testing that comes, maybe we could say, from without. I don't know if that's the right way to say it. There's testing from God, but then there's temptation that we experience. And that temptation is, that's something that comes, we connected it in episode 2 to desire. Animal appetites, beastly desires. And it's interesting here that James connects this as well to desire. God doesn't tempt anyone, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire. It's that animal appetite, and it's the part of the animal appetite that's not good. It's driven by fear and insecurity. It's driven by self-indulgence. It's driven by all that. There's the good part of your desire, and then there's what happens when your desire gets out of control. That's what drags us away, not God. That evil desire, that teshuka is the Hebrew concept. That drags us away and entices us. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and that's where sin comes from. Notice sin is the product of that wrestling match. Sin is not the root of the wrestling match. Sin is not the nature that leads to the desire, that does all that stuff. Sin is the product of the battle from the desire that leads to sin. See, so much of Christian theology, I feel like, has that backwards. We could talk about that some more, but I got to keep moving. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father, from the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. It seems like James in this opening, talking about perseverance and suffering and trials, and says, consider it joy and hang in there because maturity is coming. Perseverance is going to finish its work, and you're going to need wisdom, and so ask for it. And then in the middle of that, James says, and be careful when you're deciding you're going to be all in, because you can't be half-hearted, you can't be double-minded. Remember that it's not what it looks like. If you're going to be all in, you need to remember that the kingdom economy is upside down. And remember, as you're watching all of this, what comes from God. What comes from God is not evil. Whenever you find evil, whenever you find temptation, whenever you find the things that are in dissonance with what we're called to, that's not coming from God. Every good gift is what comes from. When you survey the trials and the sufferings and all the things you're going through, when you're looking at the temptation, when you see goodness, every good gift comes from God. And when you see the struggle, that's coming from something else. So make sure you're putting everything in its proper place, because suffering and trial and temptation is an opportunity to let perseverance finish its work. It's an opportunity to be brought to maturity. It's an opportunity to learn something about wisdom. This last year and a half has given us an opportunity to learn. Remember what comes from God. Remember what doesn't. Remember that everything is not always what it seems, that the kingdom economy is upside down, and decide that as we come out of this season, that we're going to be all in. Not kind of like half in, not hedging our bets. We're going to be all in to let God do the thing. Whatever that thing is for you, your church, your family, your job, whatever those things might be, let God do that work. Let it take hold and grow roots. Determine today that, and let's just keep walking through James and see what we keep finding as we go. I'll look forward to next time.